I am here to talk about today's open telemetry. How many of you are aware of what open telemetry is? Keep it up, keep it up. And how many of you are an expert in open telemetry, like pros? Good. So great audience for me. This is the audience that I wanted, no pros. Great. So let's dive in. So the future of instrumentation is open. And what do I mean by that? So we work with a lot of developers, a lot of you are there in the room, and we know that you like choice. That's why New Relic has choice of programming languages, cloud deployments, hybrid infrastructure, stuff like that. And we know that because that's what innovates, drives innovation and reduces toil. And when I say instrumentation, I mean including pieces of code inside your software so that emits telemetry data out so that you know how many transactions are happening, is there any error happening, where should I look at. To get those things, you have to instrument your piece of software. And there are many ways in which you can instrument. Now, a lot of you here use New Relic and you instrument using an agent. That agent itself is open source, by the way. So you can look how it is collecting that data. But imagine a world where you can deploy agent of one vendor and get the data across in another data platform. How many of you here use CloudWatch? But the only place you can use CloudWatch is AWS itself. You use New Relic, but you can only see it in New Relic data platform. What OpenTelemetry does, it allows you to segregate all of that. You can collect data, but send it to any platform of your choice. That's what OpenTelemetry can do, and we'll talk about it going forward. The proof is in the pudding, of course. So if you look at last 3 years of data ingestion on New Relic, we see a lot of customers sending us OpenTelemetry data from Prometheus, from Telegraph, from StatsD. A lot of such OpenTelemetry data sets are coming to New Relic. That means they are not coming from any agent of New Relic. It's coming from somewhere else. So it's also important to know that the adoption is really high. And why is it high? So let's look at the good old days when it all started in terms of observability. All we had was logs, right? And what logs were good for, it is very good to tell you what a software is doing at a particular point in time, but it needed a developer to know that in advance to put that in the logger so that you know. Otherwise, you wouldn't. And if you look at logs of one set of developers, they look entirely different from other set of developers. There is no correlation. There is no standard between them. Then came the world of APM agents and tracing. So there are marquee leaders like New Relic and other vendors, open source. They started collecting time slice metrics as well as traces in addition to logs. That gave you some more visibility into historic data as well and less amount of correlation needed from your part. Then between 2016 to 2018, two organizations started working on open sourcing this foundation. One was open tracing, another was open census for metrics. Now what they started doing was standardizing this data model. But again, those who know about Blu-ray and DVD know that if there are two standards, there are basically no standards. So thankfully, both of them came together and worked towards open telemetry, which is now with CNCF and flourishing. So that's what we are going to talk about going forward. So the main components. Now, what exactly helps create, or what is the building block of OpenTelemetry here? And we do have a session in the second half on OpenTelemetry where you'll be able to actually perform a lab on that, so feel free to attend that. First is the APIs, SDK, and semantics. This is the core building block. This is what defines what do you call something. So all agents collect throughput information, but somebody might call it traffic, somebody might call it RPM, someone else might call it something else. So you need a common set of semantics and API which work across all programming languages. And that is the first set that is developed. Then you need a local collector. This collector will collect those metrics and traces, transform them in some way, maybe chain itself and collect it from multiple sources and ultimately send that data out to any platform of your choice, which is the third piece, which is language SDKs. So for .NET, for Python, for Java, for different languages, OpenTelemetry is in a different stage of maturity. For Java, it is pretty mature. For other languages, it may not be. So depending on what language instrumentation you want, this will help developers include that, and we'll see an example of that going forward. And last but not the least, there are also automatic instrumentation available with OpenTelemetry. What that means is there are packages available for developers to import directly so that all this functionality is available by default, like our agents. So this last piece is very similar to our agents. But understand that in the world of OpenTelemetry, you can decide what you want from which language and deploy that as piece of code inside itself. And let's see an example of that. So the benefit of all this is pretty evident. I'll leave it up for you to read. But since it is open standard, that means cloud providers, observability vendors, they're all jumping to give you that seamless capability of having to collect from anywhere to anywhere. Now, a lot of you use Prometheus, right? How many of you are using Prometheus today? If you were to experiment with New Relic, you don't need to change anything. Prometheus can be the data collector and transformer at the source. The data platform at the back can be New Relic. So all we do is use remote write and get the data on New Relic, show you the curated dashboards, alerts, everything, but nothing changes on the Prometheus side. Again, feel free to use any open source collector per se. And then there are other benefits as well. And that allows us to use telemetry not only for developers and engineers, but also for business decision makers. Now, let's see an example of that. Now, I'm sure all of you are itching to experiment what OpenTelemetry is, itching to use it, and you can do it in the second half again. But feel free to scan this QR code. Now, what we have done is we have contributed to OpenTelemetry by launching a lot of language-specific examples of how you instrument an application. Like if you have a .NET application, how can you instrument it using OpenTelemetry? There are some ready-made examples out there, and one of those is what we are going to show you, which is minimal API. Now, what it does is it's just a simple REST API and REST endpoint which responds to a HTTP GET request with a random set of fruits. We are not going into how minimal API is actually written in .NET 6, but we are going to look at how to instrument that API if we have that. So let's look at, so we know what minimal API does. Now let's look at how we can instrument it using OpenTelemetry. Now I understand this can be a bit difficult to look at in the back, but this is the project definition. For .NET developers out there, they will know that this is a project definition in which I'm including OpenTelemetry APIs, exporter console for troubleshooting, the instrumentation which is language specific API, which is ASP.NET Core. If I am managing HTTP transactions, I've included the instrumentation for HTTP and OTLP protocols, which is a data model for OpenTelemetry. So OTLP is the data model which is standardized. So if everyone calls it transactions, nobody calls it something else, and that's how OpenTelemetry OTLP protocol, and you can collect logs as well from it. So these are the things we include right in the project definition itself. But this is not it. Inside the code itself, we decide what all do we need to collect from this piece of application. So as you can see in line number 21, you will see tracing. In line number 33, you will see metrics. So you can have one or both in your piece of code. So what are we doing here? We are first including the ASP.NET Core instrumentation here. Then we are including the HTTP client instrumentation because our minimal API will respond to any HTTP request. Console exporter is just to debug, and other OTLP exporter where we are telling it where to send that data to. This environmental variable has to be set before. This can be your New Relic API key as well. Now, this OTLP exporter header tells it to send it to a particular location. It can be any vendor, and this is where our license key comes into picture. Now, when this happens, how do you run it? All you need to do is declare in the environmental variable, sorry for that. Yep, in the endpoint you mention the API key of your New Relic account. So this is the environmental variable you set, which is used in the previous section right here. And once you do that, you just have to Docker compose up, which will create the API for the first time, and at the same time include the instrumentation in it. So what does it really sound like? Imagine if you're using Java runtime or Python packages or distribution, wouldn't it be nice that the Python package comes by default built in with this? If it does, you have this available as part of the distribution, and you do not have to install any agent for that matter. It will always collect, it might not send because it does not have that environmental variable, and that's where we are moving to with OpenTelemetry. All language distributions might have OTLP data model built in themselves. Now the same thing can happen in CodeStream. You remember the CodeStream discussion that Ganesh did? If your IDE it has the extension of CodeStream and you're writing code in it, the CodeStream extension from New Relic will understand that it is a Python code that you're writing and will automatically instrument it with Python agent. You do not have to deploy the application and then again deploy the agent. That's what you do today. You deploy the agent after the application is deployed. That is no longer needed with CodeStream. It will automatically detect the application language and deploy this. Now, once it happens, when you open localhost 8080, you will see a random name of root. That's what minimal API does. It's just showing you the functionality of it. And when it happens, you also see an entity name in New Relic, which all of you are familiar with, called minimal API, and it starts reporting the response time, throughput, everything right here. So this is very similar to the screen that you might have seen. Now we start responding to incoming requests. We show you transactions. This view will be exactly similar to the APM view that you are familiar with. So that's what OpenTelemetry does and what it is. Again, you can experiment all of that in the workshop in the second half. So New Relic loves OpenTelemetry and open source as well. As I said, our agents are open source as well. So what does it really mean? So it means that we are bringing to the OpenTelemetry community our leadership, our resources and awareness. We have spent a lot on making people aware of this OpenTelemetry option, which makes sure that you're not vendor bound as far as the data collection is concerned, and you can switch easily. At the same time, whichever instrumentation choice you have, be it Prometheus, StatsD, New Relic agent, other agents, the scale at which New Relic data platform can grow makes it an obvious choice. So we have customers who started with Prometheus, but suddenly hit a roadblock in terms of scaling it up. So for a moment it was fine, but suddenly they had to deploy Thanos, and the scale of nodes did not conform to the data model at the back. They started having problems. So that's what New Relic can help you solve at the back. And last but not the least, of course, since we have this connected experience, we not only contribute to the community, we also help you deploy OpenTelemetry. Even if it is open source, if you are a New Relic customer, you can contact New Relic support to get support on OpenTelemetry, which is again unique, which you will not get anywhere else. So we are completely committed to this, and again, a lot of options here. So you can expect New Relic to continue actively working on OpenTelemetry, and if you are interested to learn more about it, the place is the GitHub link that I showed you earlier. Just search with GitHub New Relic and OpenTelemetry, and you will find a lot of language specific examples of how to do it in Java, how to do it in other languages. So you can start there. And the second option is, of course, developers.newrelic.com is our developer page wherein you can again try out multiple things with New Relic.